Okay, again, welcome today. My name is Stacy Reese. I'm the Director for Student Activities Involvement and Leadership. And we're here today to talk about what we think we know about Paris, what we see in the media, but we also want to talk about why France, what now, and what does this mean for the future for France, the Middle East, Europe, and the United States as a whole. We're lucky today to have 3 faculty members from the Political Science and International Studies Department, and that I'm going to turn it over to them to each introduce themselves, give some comments and discussion points for us today regarding our topic, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. For the Q&A section, if you can just make sure to raise your hand high, because I'm going to be the one bringing the mic to you so you can ask your questions. All right. Without further ado, please go ahead.
Okay. Thank you. Can everyone hear me? Yeah? Okay, good. Thank you. My name is Kristen Edquist, and I am an Associate Professor of Political Science and Director of the International Affairs Program. The 3 of us, unfortunately, our 4th colleague wasn't able to make it today. Her car wasn't able to make it down the hill because there were already 6 others in the ditch, apparently. So we will, my colleagues and I, Dr. Majid Sharifi, who's immediately to my left here, and Dr. Kevin Perch, will each talk, although the order will actually be myself, Dr. Perch, and then Dr. Sharifi, for about 10 minutes. And then we'll open it up for questions and discussion. We do have until 1:30. Technically, I have to leave a little bit earlier to start my class. And I know a lot of you have to leave before 1, so please be quiet on your way out if you would. But the order of discussion will be, I will cover mostly Europe. Dr. Perch will cover the U.S.'s response. And then Dr. Sharifi will discuss matters in the Middle East. So what's my expertise? Stacy asked me to mention, well, I teach European politics here, and I did my dissertation research on European integration. So I've been following the European Union for over 20 years now. I love Europe, so there you go. But what I would like to do first, before I start in on my argument, which is about French politics, is review the details, just to make sure everybody's sort of on the same page about the attacks in Paris, which are the instigation for this talk today. And so I just have one slide here. It's not as easy to see as I would have hoped, but this is a map of parts of Paris, and it marks the locations of the attacks that happened on November 13th. And as you see, the largest circle in the top middle there is the Stade de France, which is the stadium, which fortunately was not penetrated by attackers. 2 attackers were suicide bombers on the outside, and 1 person died aside from the suicide bombers there. And then there were other attacks in these lower circles down below, where there were far more casualties and deaths. 89 people were killed by, I think it was 3 attackers in the Bataclan, which was a music hall. And then there were several cafes and restaurants in that part of Paris that were attacked by gunmen with rifles. Now there are 10 suspects, 9 who have been located, 1 who is at large. And I'll start to talk about their identities because I think it's very important to understand who they are in order to understand some of these events, okay? So now I'll start my sort of more formal remarks here. As political scientists, we discuss the causes and effects of politically significant events. We also offer interpretations and constructions of meaning of these events. Clearly, the events in Paris on November 13th were politically significant, not only for France, but for the European Union, of which France is a member, for the Middle East, to which some of the attackers were tangentially or directly tied, and for the United States, which has close ties to France and, of course, extensive involvement in Middle Eastern politics. So again, we all know essentially what happened. Bombers blew themselves up and killed one other person outside a stadium, which the French President Francois Hollande had been attending. A nightclub was attacked, killing 89 people, and a three-man gang killed 40 people in restaurants and cafes. In my remarks, I would like to propose an interpretation of the events in Paris on November 13th. That they reflect not only an unsurprising, to those who have watched ISIS lately, response to France and its engagement in the Middle East, but also that they reflect deeply problematic domestic tensions in France and in the European Union. This is as much a France problem as it is a problem in the Middle East or anywhere else. As the Washington Post noted on November 15th, Europeans and their governments are confronting a chilling reality at home. A rogues gallery of homegrown terrorists with links to Islamist groups has become large enough and is acting stealthily enough to make tracking them increasingly difficult for the region's intelligence agencies. Why do I want to say that this is as much a domestic problem for France as it is a sort of international intervention into France? Of the 9 or 10, depending on whom you consult, suspected attackers, 6 of them were French. 1 of them was Belgian, and the 3 others' identities are still unknown. 6 of them were French. These are homegrown terrorists, okay? 3 of them moved between France and Belgium, being between notoriously unsettled districts. 3 of them are known to have connections with people in Syria who are suspected of fighting with or for the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, or the Levant, also known as ISIS or ISIL or Daesh. 1 appears to have received a fake passport of a soldier who was killed by ISIS in Syria. Okay. But again, 6 of them were French and 1 of them was Belgian. Okay, so that's where I wanted to start. Why France then? Well, political geography plays a large role as to why these attacks happened in France. Europe has 15 million Muslims. By all accounts, France has the largest population of Muslims in Western Europe. The numbers vary greatly. In the research that I've done, they estimate between 2.1 million to up to 10 million Muslims. About 33 of these who are migrants originate from Muslim-dominant countries and profess to practice Islam. Of course, the percentage of Muslims who are radical political Islamists is far smaller. Okay. Another reason that we need to think about this as a homegrown problem for France, as in a domestic problem, is that France has had for at least 15 years a real challenge in dealing with the large housing projects in which most Muslim immigrant families and their children and their grandchildren live. In 2005, many of you will recall, there was a series of over 72,000 violent incidents across France. Cars were burned. 9,000 cars were burned. There were riots all over France. France was aflame. And this was largely, nobody claimed any connection to Allah. There was not an Islamist element to these uprisings, but there was definitely an immigrant family connection. France has had a problem for some time in how to deal with integration of migrants into its community, into its national identity. So France has known for a long time about this, and indeed many of in the more recent these most recent events, most of the experts whose work I've read suggest that in fact these attacks should have been no surprise. Of course, in January we had the Charlie Hebdo attacks. which were not related to these in the sense that those were related to, inspired by Al-Qaeda, and but they were French citizens who perpetrated those attacks as well. Okay, so there are connections there. Okay, but in this case, in this particular event, the citizens were largely European, and they did have some connections with ISIS. Another reason we need to think about this as a European domestic problem is that, in fact, Belgium, which is, of course, right next to France. Oh, by the way, here's the map of the Paris riots of French riots of 2005. These were events all over the country. And you can see some of the data up there to the left. Many millions of euros worth of damage were done between January and November, most of it actually in November. Okay, so almost exactly a decade ago, we saw this unrest in France already. Okay, and then here's a map of the European Union. As you can see, Belgium is directly to the east of France. Belgium, which is the site of many European institutions and of the European Union's headquarters for its commission, has been a site for the sort of fermentation of Islamist extremism. Its proximity to France, 200 miles between Brussels and Paris, means that, in fact, a lot of networking can go on across these borders. And because the European Union is what it is, namely a quasi-federal system in a way, in which there are open borders, passport checks do not occur for European citizens, networking can happen very easily across these borders. And that's exactly what did happen apparently in this particular case. Some of the attackers had been born in Belgium, were naturalized French citizens, but had moved back to Belgium and to Molenbeek, which is a particularly sort of less savory neighborhood, unstable neighborhood in Brussels. Okay, so Brussels and Paris connections are very heavy and easily exploited. Okay, let's see here. So what is France? And so that's my primary take on this. But what is France and what is Europe learning from these events? Again, there's an emerging pattern among Europe's homegrown extremists. They are petty criminals who were radicalized and became far more religious than their parents. Petty criminals who are first gangsters and then they become terrorists, which is a very different thing, right? That's where you get to the international influence. Several of the attackers in Paris who were French citizens actually did end up going to Syria for a while, got trained in all sorts of ways, and as one police officer in Belgium argued, became really traumatized by the terrible things they saw and did under the ISIS umbrella. And they come back and they're sort of damaged goods by that point. And they're sort of ripe for exploitation by those who wish to use sort of Islamist, really extreme, violent, or just violent beliefs in order to exact damage. Okay? So it's a very peculiar phenomenon. If we were to compare this to 9/11, for example, in the US, it's very different, right? These are homegrown. Right? They go abroad, they come back. They know the locations, they've lived in the locations, they have grown up in the locations where they are doing the attacking, and many people already know them. But in some ways they've changed. Maybe you've read the story of the young woman who was seized in the riot, the siege of this apartment, which is at the very top. That's the top black circle. That's where an apartment was seized in Saint-Denis, which is a sort of notorious neighborhood in Paris. And she was a young woman who, her family, 6 months ago would never have dreamed this of her. She was a French citizen. But she later becomes part of this sort of terrorist organization right away. Okay? So this is where I don't think it's like 9/11 in a way, although it is traumatic to France in that way. But it's a very different sort of phenomenon. Okay? So what does this mean for France domestically? First, French Muslims are in a very, very difficult place. One of the major officers in the police and one of the highest-ranking officers of Muslim descent in France said, the great majority of French Muslims are completely integrated in France. The bad guys want a clash of civilizations. The Muslim community is taken hostage. They are viewed with suspicion by non-Muslims, but the Islamists say that they are not true Muslims. So they are essentially in a very, very difficult position. Nonetheless, he does believe the Paris attacks will cause an unprecedented backlash against extremism among French Muslims, who will, again, not side with these extreme activities and extremely violent activities. Okay. France is generally terrified right now. Apparently, there have been several instances where people have reacted and overreacted to the sound of a firecracker or something. People run out in the streets and they're completely scared. French authorities are rethinking their internal security, which was reformed in 2008, in a way that apparently has not worked very well. But regarding French and European foreign policy, and this is where I'll end my remarks here. So what will France do? What will the European Union do? And here's where I'll turn to the next map, and here is Europe in the sort of larger Middle Eastern, North African context. Hopefully you can see that. I've tried to mark with arrows where, of course, France, especially Paris is, and then the red arrow where Syria is, because those are the two most prominent countries mentioned in all of this. France did not invoke an article of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization Agreement, which is France's biggest alliance, and that includes the US, Canada, and multiple European countries as well as Turkey. Instead, they invoked a particular clause in the European Union treaties, which says that they're asking for support from their European Union fellow member states, of which there are 27. Okay. However, and this is something I get from a very well-known scholar named Olivier Roy, France is really alone in identifying ISIS as the preeminent global threat. Therefore, a massive ground operation seems out of the question, if only because there are too many who oppose, who disagree with the idea that ISIS is the preeminent threat. Your East European member states of the European Union don't see ISIS as the main threat. They, in fact, see Russia as the main threat. Right? Russia has been active in Ukraine for over a year now and annexed the Crimea. They do not perceive ISIS as the biggest threat, whereas France obviously is positioning itself to say that it does. Germany will probably not support a large European Union level effort. It simply does not take that position on these things. So France is going to have a difficult task ahead of it. It's going to ask for help from Saudi Arabia, probably Iran, and certainly Russia, has already been mentioned. I think Hollande is supposed to meet with President Putin of Russia pretty soon here to try to form a coalition to attack Syria. And of course, the events of last night kind of put that in question too. I'm referring to a Turkey shot down Russian warplane that was flying over its airspace. So, attacks on Syria will be difficult, and it will be hard for France to actually try and galvanize support for some sort of international coalition against Syria, except by air, which the U.S. is already conducting along with France, the Netherlands, Denmark, and a few other states. Okay? But that, of course, helps make France a target in the first place, at least in ISIS's eyes. Okay? So that's where I'll turn it over to Dr. Kevin Perch.
Thank you, Hi, can you hear me? Yeah, okay. Yeah, a little bit, maybe. Now? Yeah, okay. So I'll just start yelling, apparently, too, and make it so everyone can hear me. Thank you very much. My name's Kevin Perch. I'm a professor in the political science department. My area of focus is on American government and U.S. institutions, the Congress and the presidency especially. I really have to confess, I wrote what I thought was a really beautiful little talk for this discussion today, and I was feeling really proud about it. And then I woke up this morning, and then I saw the news, and I saw that the Turkish Air Force had shot down a Russian fighter jet, probably over Turkish airspace, and I thought, oh goodness, there goes everything that I was planning on talking about, because everything suddenly changed in the past 24 hours. And that's part of this for us, is that this is a very, very fluid situation, especially for the United States. And what you think you know today might not be what you know tomorrow, and it's certainly not what you know last week. So the very first thing that the United States has to contend with is that the Russians have started bombing in Syria. And they're bombing what they say is ISIS or ISIL forces, but pretty much everyone else on the planet is saying that that might not be the group that they're mainly targeting, that they're probably targeting other forces. And so while doing this, the Turkish have been claiming that the Russians, I keep almost saying Soviets, which is a really big problem I have, but they keep claiming that the Russians have been entering into Turkish airspace since they started running these bombing campaigns, and the Turks have been threatening that they will defend their sovereign airspace. Well, according to Turkey, last night they decided to defend their sovereign airspace and shot down a Russian fighter jet that was over there. Now, this is an issue for the United States because, as Dr. Edquist mentioned, Turkey and the United States, along with most of Western Europe and Canada, is part of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And the North Atlantic Treaty Organization treats an attack on any one country as an attack on all of the countries. So if Turkey, while France hasn't done this, if Turkey invokes Article 5, if Russia decides to respond to Turkey, and Turkey invokes Article 5, what this means for the United States is that we would have to consider any attack on Turkey as an attack on the United States of America, which would mean that the United States could get indirectly brought into a war against Russia, which is really probably one of the last things anybody really, really wants. And so one of the first things when we start talking about what does the United States want after Paris is we're really hoping that calmer heads prevail. We're really concerned. France is currently going around, and while they haven't gotten much support among the political elite, among a large amount of the population in the United States and in Western Europe, you're seeing people who are starting to view ISIS as the main threat. You're starting to see calls go out that maybe we should have, land forces going into Syria. And so this is something that the United States is getting concerned about, especially as we start to see Russia getting more and more active in Syria. Our main problem in the United States is not so much a military going into Syria, but what happens the day after the military goes into Syria. This is going to become our major concern. Currently, there are three major different groups that are fighting in Syria. You have the Assad regime that has got the Russian backing, that the United States has said is a threat, and we very much want to see the Assad regime removed from power. You have ISIS or ISIL controlling some sections of of the ground, and you also see free Syrian forces controlling other parts. And that's a loose coalition that is, in many regards, defined as they're not in favor of Assad, they're not in favor of ISIL, so they're together. The Russians have been largely bombing the Free Syrian forces, who we largely consider to be our allies in the region, in support of
Al-Nusra.
Al-Nusra, yeah.
It's Al-Qaeda in Arabic.
Al-Nusra, okay.
It translates to Al-Qaeda in Syria.
Okay. Okay, that's who, by and large, the Russians are bombing. Yeah, that's what I'm saying, is that's who the Syrians are, the Russians are bombing in support of Assad. We're primarily bombing ISIS. Our question is, who takes the power in Syria? That's the big question for the United States of America. That's what we're trying to figure out. One of our hopes was we were having diplomatic ties, diplomatic conversations with Putin to see if Putin could get Assad to leave, which might smooth the way to some type of transition away from this civil war. After today with Turkey and the Air Force, the shoot down, we don't know what Putin's response is going to be. So for us today, we're not so much actors as, in large part, reactors. We're concerned about what the French are going to be doing. We're concerned about what the Russians are going to be doing. We're concerned about what the Turkish are going to be doing. We honestly don't really know who we're supporting in the sense that we're looking for somebody. Not ISIS, not Assad, so someone else. This is where we're at right now. What is the United States' main goal right now? Calmer heads. That's kind of what we're hoping for. How we get there, if you've looked at our foreign policy of late, we don't really have a good answer to that one. No. I'm going to keep it brief so we can open it up for other questions and comments afterwards.
Okay, great.
Thank you very much. You hear me, I guess. My name is Majid Sharifi, Professor of International Relations. I work for the Department of Political Science here. And I've been working on the idea of nationalism and its relationship with security and insecurity in the Middle East, Iran in particular, but Middle East in general. And so perhaps I have been looking at this for a little bit of a long time, and I don't see this as an incident or isolated incident. I see it as only a slide in a very long, painful movie I've been personally experiencing for many decades in my life, and I would say even the life of my father. So this is not an incident that happened in a social, political, economic, historical vacuum. Paris is related to all the things that has been happening for the last many decades in the Middle East. From there, I don't know if I'm an expert, but so I do have some knowledge of the Middle East. With that, I want to open up with this poem and take the conversation to a different kind of angle. And as you guys know, of course, Paris is tragic. The events are tragic. But let me just look at it from a different perspective through the words of another person. It is not Paris we should pray for. It is the world. It is a world in which Beirut, reeling from bombing 2 days before Paris, is not covered in the press. A world in which a bomb goes off at a funeral in Baghdad and not even one person's status update says Baghdad. Pray for the world that blames a refugee crisis for terrorist attack, that does not pause to differentiate between the attacker and the person running from the very same thing you are. Pray for a world where people walking across countries for months, their belonging upon their backs, are told they have no place to go. Say a prayer for Paris, by all means, but pray more. More for the world that does not have a prayer. Not have prayer for those who no longer have a home to defend. For a world that is falling apart in all corners, and not simply in the towers and cafes we find so familiar. So this is the world in which Paris is taking place. 2 days before that, in Baghdad, few days before that in Beirut, or 2 days before that in Beirut, few days before that in Baghdad, a week before that in Turkey, 130 people died in a demonstration, and not too much of a coverage. It was ISIS blame. It's a world where Russian airliner was down, 250 people died, and no condolences, not from our leaders or leaders of the so-called West, to the Russian people or Russian president. This is a world where every day there is something is happening, some bombing is happening in Baghdad, in Syria, in Damascus, hundreds and tens of them in Aleppo and other places in Syria. And it's silent. This is a world where Yemen, as we speak right now, Saudi Arabia and the coalition of US-backed coalition have a sanction on Libya, and according to United Nations, 82% of the 30 million people in Yemen, not Libya, I'm sorry, I misspoke, Yemen, are starving to death according to United Nations. No one is hearing it. It's criminal to see the silence in the media. This is the world in which we're living, and this is the world where Paris is occurring. And of course, with all the tragedies that happen in Paris, we should see it as a connection with what I would call a regime of security, or we might say insecurity. There is a regime defining it in terms of many actors with different interests converging to create a set of norms, practices, rules that are creating this hyper reality, this unbelievable reality in Syria. And we should see it systematically, as I said, as a film, a long, tragic, bloody film. And this is a world where there are millions, as we speak, of nameless, stateless, faceless, voiceless. People have no voice. And they have become instrument of great powers and the failure of those failing states. If Syria is a failed state and ISIS is in Syria, we should look at it from the perspective of why Syria is a failed state. I traveled to Syria. It's one of the most peaceful, loving countries I have ever traveled to. Beautiful, peace-loving people. What happened to the same people that I could sit down with, talk, enjoy, and all of a sudden, some of the same youth, they becoming these criminal actors that are beheading people? What happened? It couldn't be just happening by itself. So from there, I'm not going to really talk too much. I think you already understand my position here. And I opened up the question. Before doing that, I want to pose a few demystification here. First, ISIS is not, we always talk about it as radical Islam. Can we really say that ISIS is Islamic? I would say it doesn't represent Muslims or Islam or in any sense of the word, any sects. Just for an idea that sometimes is so confusing and frustrating when you see CNN and other presses. Islam is an idea, just like Christianity and Judaism, socialism, liberalism, fascism, whatever. It's an idea. Idea can't be killed, barred, imprisoned, or whatnot. It is only manifested in a collectivity, in behavior of people. Then you name it. That idea, Islam and Muslims are two different things. Yes, we do have a world in which 1.5 million people believe in this idea. But this idea manifests in them so differently. There are so many sects and religions and beliefs, the way people understand it. So it's not a unified idea, and Islam and Muslims are a unified block of people. But you can see that the conflation and confusion between Islam and Muslims. And from 1.5 billion Muslims, a great majority of them are peaceful people and they desire peace. So it's not about Muslims. From those millions and billions of the Muslims, the very narrow segment of these Muslims, we could call them in English fundamentalists, sometimes we call them Salafist, millions of them, that believe in literal understanding of Islam. But from those million Salafis, call them fundamentalists, pretty much like Christian fundamentalists, very narrow segment of this population believe in jihad as a struggle, violent armed struggle against the West or against whatever. They haven't picked up armed or anything like that. So we have very narrow so-called radical jihadists, which we usually equated with terrorists, which is not the same. And then from thousands or so of these, let's call them terrorists for the lack of any better words. From them, we have terrorists we love and care for and like and support and equip, and we have terrorists we don't like. And the case in Syria is exactly the same. We don't like ISIS as a terrorist group, an organization, but we don't mind Jabhat al-Nusra and the rest of them. We call them moderates, moderate terrorists. We don't like it. We don't like ISIS, just like we didn't like Al-Qaeda. But the brothers of Al-Qaeda we support in Jordan and Turkey, and we create this situation in which, as Dr. Perch said, we don't really know who we're fighting, who are friends, who are foes. So we must really take a step back to see who are friends, who are foes, and how we define terrorism. The second myth I want to talk about is hundreds of thousands of people joined ISIS. That's another myth. ISIS, not hundreds of thousands of people have joined ISIS from Europe. In fact, we know that 400 British have joined ISIS, let's say, just an example. And that makes 0.00027% of the number of population in UK. That is 1/10th of 1% of the population of Muslims in UK, 3.7 million of them. So where is all of these myth coming from? ISIS is so big now in our myth that we can't fight it. 64, sometimes 62, sometimes it's 65. The coalition of countries, US-led coalition, is 64 countries are fighting ISIS and we can't eliminate it? Come on, give me a break. What's going on? It's not as big. The people who are under control of ISIS are between 5 to 7 million. The best estimate, or the most estimate, is 10 million people. They have between 20 to 30,000 soldiers. This is not a big army. It is a threat. Certainly it is. It's a criminal organization. Certainly it is. It is a terrorist organization. Certainly it is. But why is it there? So the fourth myth connected to this. Are we really, when I say we, I don't mean you and I, is U.S. government really treating ISIS as a threat or as a balancer? I would argue as a balancer. It's using ISIS as a balancer, not a threat. And with that, there are other myths, huge myths that I want to talk about, but I think my 5 or 7 minutes in finish. I leave this as an introduction so we can open up the conversation about any one of those topics. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to open up for the question section of the panel. Who would like to ask the first question?
Thank you. So you hit on the importance earlier of where did this start? You know, it's not just an immediate incident that just happened to scratch at, you know. Who are the powers that created ISIS? Who invaded Iraq and created a power vacuum and then funded radical-based rebels that you called, which are al-Nusra, and the United States has no distinct way of determining who is a moderate rebel or not. We're just giving weapons. What happened to all of Muammar Gaddafi's weapons from Libya? Heavy weapons, small weapons, where did those go? Shipped across the Mediterranean, smuggled in via Turkey into Syria. Okay, so who are the people funding this? And you said that Paris is not like 9/11. I would argue it is like 9/11 because it's going to be used to further government agendas, to implement further restrictions on people where they lose their rights, and further.
I wouldn't disagree.
Further justify further involvement in the.
Yeah. Do you have a question?
On another thing. Yeah, I'm getting to that. So.
Great.
I think, can I suggest something, my friend here? I think for this you have great points, and I know you're not addressing this question to me and they're going to answer. But for this dialogue to be productive, I think we should, each one of us, let's pose a question or a comment, and let's talk about it one at a time. Now, you pose a great question. Okay, why don't, yeah, that's...
How is this not going to further implement restrictions on French
I
people
would never.
European people as 9/11 did to us?
I did never say that. In a different way. I was analyzing it as in the sense that it wasn't like 9/11 in that the origins of the conflict were domestic, not international. I'm sorry if I didn't make myself clear enough. Definitely, I agree that the immigrants that are coming from Syria, flooding Europe, are going to be shut out. And I think it's a terrible tragedy. So please do not misunderstand.
Follow up, you also talked about the alliance with Saudi Arabia, and you said it's not foreign influence. So who is behind the Wahhabist, mullah-trained radical Islamic schools that are funded by Saudi Arabia, and that's where they're trained? So
who is that question for? I'm sorry.
Anybody. So how is that? I guess
so clear. I mean, you're pointing to the U.S. for sure.
You said that they go to the Middle East, become radicalized, and come back. Where are they, and how are they becoming radicalized? Who is funding that? Where are they getting these weapons? Where are they getting, in the caves?
From the U.S. and Western Europe.
Yeah, that's right.
I absolutely know that. This is a global phenomenon, right? There are roots in Paris, there are roots in Syria, there are roots in the US, there are roots in Western Europe. It's an extremely complex confluence of factors, right? But my point was to highlight the French factors. I certainly would never discount the international factors at all. Right? I would never say this is a unidirectional from France only. Absolutely. The U.S. intervention in Iraq has destabilized the region. Absolutely. Right? And we can go into, talking about U.S. foreign policy. You're making very good points here. Absolutely. Please don't misunderstand. Interventions like this into such a complex process, you really need to take the time to be careful about how you frame things. But absolutely. So I appreciate the comments. Yes, we had a question here.
I was just wondering if the timing of when the attacks happened has any significance, especially the U.S. elections coming up too, and if that, how the elections will play out through it, because obviously the U.S. will be involved some way.
That's a great question. For France, there isn't any significant political event happening. This is not like the Atocha bombings in 2004 in Spain, which happened 3 days before an election and actually sent the Spanish government to the socialists immediately. No, in this case, it doesn't look like there's any immediate political motive. And that's where it is slightly different than some other attacks. Again, it's what I've read says, analysts are saying, ISIS is changing its tactics. It used to be about territory in the Levant, in the Middle East. Now it's doing stuff that it had never done before, right? Attacking, shooting down a Russian airliner, right? Killing people in foreign countries and not dealing with the region itself. This is a very different thing, and it's not something that they had expected to see. So that's a good question, though. And you go ahead.
And to that, I haven't heard anything that it, the U.S. election, we had the longest election process of any country on the planet. So you're talking 18, 20 months is what we get for the presidential election. So I don't think that was, I haven't heard any evidence to that it was there. The honest answer to what impact this will have on the U.S. election, I think probably if this was just this, if Belgium, opens up and nothing else happens, this will probably not be a major impact on the U.S. elections. The U.S. electorate is very fickle and has an incredible short-term memory, an incredibly weak short-term memory. If you don't remember, in 2014, the election was in large part argued about Ebola and Ebola scares, and should we shut down the borders, and what are we going to do about Ebola? And you're all laughing at me right now because you're like, oh my God, we really thought that, and the answer is yeah. And so I can promise you that hopefully, if this was just Paris, by the time the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November comes around, this won't be what you're discussing, if this was just it. Now, there are certain members, especially on the Republican side for the primaries, I'm thinking Rubio has made comments, Trump has made comments, Carson has made a few comments that are trying to make this bigger. They see that this is a way that they can project presidential toughness. What would I do? I would just be tough, and that's not talking about what you do day two, or that's not talking about what you do afterwards. But in that regard, maybe it influences the primaries a little bit, but you're not, because you're all smart. But we go on to the next thing really quickly.
Well, I think I differ a little bit from Dr. Perch here. I do agree with you that it doesn't have, perhaps this particular event doesn't have that much of an effect, but as it does have a long trajectory. And why I say that, because it's been a trend in U.S. foreign policy making, which is very much related to its domestic politics, is to look tough. To look tough sometimes for no reason at all, and no rationale behind it. And more this rationality is hidden under the name of security and not knowing secret information and all of that. So we went to Iraq 2003, knowing at least the community that I am a part of, which, and Dr. Edquist, so I'm sure we've had that conversation. We know that the intellectual community, the academic community, was very aware that what's going to happen. There was no second option or second plan or B plan or C plan or what's going to happen, but the academia pretty much knew what's going to happen. And they knew that this is going to be really huge. It's going to create a vacuum. It's going to create a failed state. And in failed state, the result, we had seen it so many places in Sudan, Somalia, Afghanistan, Pakistan, terrorism going to come up. It's going to be terrorism because we are destroying the state, and non-state actors become terrorists by definition. That is the way we define terrorism, non-state actors that are using violence for political purposes. That's the very definition of, according to Kofi Annan's definition of terrorism. So when you break a state, you breed terrorism. And this is exactly what happened, going back to our student here about where it came from. Yes, ISIS was born in Iraq, the Islamic State of Iraq. Of course, it was weak. It was a deviation, or at least a branch of Al-Qaeda. The breeding ground was in a prison in Anbar. That was where the training camp happened. Still, the elites by name, I don't want to bore you with names, not that I remember all of them, but the breeding ground for the creation of ISIS was this particular prison where all of the elites, the current elites of ISIS, were in fact cellmates. And they trained there, and they recruited there, and they built up interpersonal trust and a network. And this was a prison that was run by the U.S. Then from there,
sorry. I'm sorry.
Let me just this, and then you can. From there, of course, ISIS was doomed to fail. Doomed to fail until we decided to support the so-called democracy, and I say so-called because it was definitely the aspiration, a democratic aspiration in Syria, and definitely Bashar al-Assad is a dictator, was a dictator. His father was a murderer dictator, like many of the other leaders in the Middle East. No question about that. But when we decided to say, Assad got to go, and no alternative. What's going to happen after Assad, we didn't know. And then when we decided to support and train insurgents in Turkey, in Jordan, with the money from Qatar and Saudi Arabia and Turkey itself, we enabled ISIS, and ISIS became big. Became huge, became Islamic State of Sham and Levant first, and then Islamic State. So you can see the root. All these things are connected, certainly. Yes, Dr. Edwards, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. Just one thing to follow up on your question. I think it's very interesting about the political sort of ramifications. One thing that I noticed was in my research in 2005, analysts were comparing Europe to the U.S. and saying, why does Europe have all these assimilation problems when the U.S. is such a successful place for immigrants to assimilate, right, peacefully, right, and without this sort of, but, and one quote was, well, in the U.S. you'd never find a political party that's anti-immigrant. Whereas in Europe you would, and that was their main form of identity, was that they were anti-immigrant. But I would submit that one party in the U.S. is becoming very close to being an anti-immigrant party. It's very concerning, right? It's very concerning. So, whether this has helped foment that, unfortunately, right? Even amongst, including some Democrats in the U.S., but certainly most Republican governors I know have taken a stance that, Syrian immigrants are not welcome, which is indeed the very tragedy that Dr. Sharifi was talking about, right? These people are fleeing from horrific conditions. We had bad conditions because we lost our power last week, right? They lost their power, their homes, their health, their hospitals, their family members. I mean, it's incomparable, right? So they're fleeing from something real bad. So anyhow.
All right, we have a question back here.
Sort of related to the last question, the last comment you made, but how would this affect right-wing nationalist parties in Europe, specifically like France, like the National Front, like the way the socialists are acting, they're like co-opting the center right. So if you want another option, you go to the far right, or how I assume in the United Kingdom this would help UKIP, and they want to like leave the European Union. Like potentially, if like there is more terrorism. And with all the other problems the European Union has, like, would this like undo the European Union, and then how that would how its role is counterbalancing the United States and other things?
That's a fantastic question. I mean, Europe has been undergoing austerity measures since 2008 because of the financial crisis. That's part of the reason it had to cut some of its security forces. That's been one of the reasons that some security forces blame for the lapse in intelligence that allowed for these attacks to occur before they could could have been intervened, they argue. Will Europe will struggle on in terms of being an economic union. Politically, I think it's in a very, very difficult position right now, especially if France continues and really pushes for a strong military action against Syria, which Germany wouldn't necessarily want. If France can take the leadership in that particular role in the way that it has, the immigrant crisis is another entire issue. By the way, we will be having a panel next quarter about that particular issue, migrant issue in Europe. But this is a huge challenge for Europe. Right? I mean, just 2 months ago, there was a little toddler who was washed up on the shores of, what was it, Cyprus, or was it Greece? I can't remember. It caused an enormous amount of sympathy, an outpouring of sympathy for all the immigrants coming into Europe. Enormous. 2 months later, people are saying, shut the borders. Right? I mean, it's unfortunately can be very, this kind of politics can be very fickle. So. Mm-hmm.
I have a question about New York Times has an opinion article about how our democracy is going to protect themselves against other terrorist attacks, since these ones are kind of hitting hard at home for most people. The idea is, since Europe doesn't have much of a Second Amendment as the U.S. does, would these discussions start amending those other countries' constitutional rights for self-protection of any sort?
You mean their right to vend their own sovereignty, or? I'm not sure I understand the question.
Would the countries
right to what?
take more police activity to the streets, or would they give the protection back to the citizen?
Okay, yeah, right. Right, I mean, no, Europeans certainly have far less right to bear arms. But they do have the right to govern themselves. And to the extent that you declare an emergency state, which France has done for the next 3 months, there'll be a political price to pay if you extend that even further, I would imagine, right? Some people probably don't want it at all right now. But, I don't see European leaders, well, it's the people themselves who are going to be deciding this, and they may end up being very scared. I mean, this has been going on for, again, over a decade, this kind of fear of the Muslim unknown. And the Netherlands has passed more strict measures on all sorts of behavior and immigration. The Danes have. I mean, these are open, tolerant societies that are turning really, really strangely right-wing. And I think that's where you need to really watch. It's not so much elites sort of clamping down on the liberties of the masses, but the masses clamping down on each other, in a way. That's what I would be most concerned about.
Regardless of how ISIL was created, they've shown an amazing ability to reach out and touch us in the West, far more so than Al-Qaeda even could. Given that, and since we know really the only way to uproot them will be a ground campaign, whether it's us or our allies in the region, does the West have the stomach for the kind of war that we'll need to wage against them?
Go ahead.
Well, and this is only my personal opinion here, my colleagues can actually oppose this. ISIS is a political phenomenon. It doesn't have a military solution. Your question, in fact, assumes a military solution. We already have the biggest military in the world in the history. Just US. We don't need really any allies to help us to eliminate ISIS. It could be eliminated. But the elimination of ISIS, let's say those 20, 30,000 soldiers, that's like 2 hours of work in World War II. It was nothing. 100,000 people died in Tokyo in one night, was burned to death. Or we could just bomb Raqqa. Hell with it, 500,000 people. It's not any bigger than, let's say, Nagasaki. or Hiroshima or anything like that. But that's not the question. It's not the question is not that we don't have the material and military capability to destroy ISIS. This is exactly how we dealt with Al-Qaeda. This is exactly how we dealt with Taliban. This is exactly how we dealt with many other solutions. There are political problems and they need political solution. And so long as we are on this campaign of toughness, we're going to show them, I am tougher. This party, Republican Party, wants to show that they are, whoa, much tougher than Obama or Democrats. We are pretty much repeating a mistaken history.
I think I would second that we're starting to see political actors around the world who are starting to realize that, it's not a state. I mean, I know they want to say it's the Islamic State, but it's not a state in a traditional standard. I mean, it holds territory, but it's an idea more than anything else. And I think probably the clearest idea that international actors are starting to get this idea that maybe there's not a true military solution is Putin has shown a long history of not being afraid to use military force to conquer territory in various ways. And, you can see this with Crimea, Eastern Ukraine. The fact that even, I don't want to say this like badly, but Putin's even showing hesitation about doing this. It's just bomb them. And then bomb a few select targets and maybe not even bomb there. I think what you're starting to see is that maybe there might be a different solution. And our trick then is to find that solution. I see like 6 of your faces saying, well, what is that solution? And the answer is, I don't know if we know what that solution is yet. Or you might have an idea of what the solution is, but powerful elites don't have that solution. That, yes, you could go into Syria and you can occupy Syria. But that didn't really help in Afghanistan. That didn't really help in Iraq. That didn't help in these other countries. Now you just have an army of occupation there. So could we have
Russia's only foreign military base is in Syria, while the United States has hundreds of military bases all around the world. Russia's only foreign military base is in Syria. So when you say boots on the ground, man, how are you going to fight them with boots on the ground when you're inherently funding them and equipping them at the same time? And if you attack ISIS, then you'd be helping Russia. The end game is Russia. The end game is Iran. The end game is destabilization in the region to utilize their resources unchallenged.
Let me just add to this conversation a little bit, if I may, and then we go to that question. We have, right now on the table, there is a political solution. Actually, there has been political solution on the table since 2012. The idea is to have all of the people, all of the countries, both regional and global, that wanted to Assad to go, to give them a way out. The difference is that Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and US, and Britain, and France, mostly US allies, they want Assad to go from the get-go, very simply. And it's a political issue, even though they know this is not a good solution, perhaps, or the best solution. They want him to go immediately, at the start of the negotiation. Of course, that didn't go in 2012, Geneva I and Geneva II. Now we are in Vienna, and actually there is a conversation going on this week. It's going to be going on this week. The idea that let's just find a political solution for Assad transition. Assad transition to Russia and Iran, and many supporters of Assad, which are not few, in Syria. You got to remember, from every 5 refugees, 3 of them are living under or go under the umbrella of Syrian regime. And if today there is election in Syria, Bashar al-Assad will be elected as a popular leader. He is more popular today among his social base than he was 6 years ago. That's ironic, but that's true, because there is no alternative. They've seen what these fragmented, radical, crazy, mostly uneducated, previously criminal or petty criminals unemployed, marginalized people can do. There is no political solution for them. It's going to be genocide. So everybody knows it. Most people know it. Christian knows it, Armenian know it, Druze know it in Syria, Sunni merchants know it, many of the Sunni groups know it, many, let me just not go to, Alawites know it, Shiites know it, name it. And by the way, the Assad regime was a minoritarian regime. Alawis are between 8 to 15% of the population there. But the Assad regime was not representing only Alawis. This is only a myth broadcast by CNN and ABC and our mass media, unfortunately. It was a minoritarian as opposed to majoritarian regime in the sense that Assad represents the Sunni rich industrialists, urban Sunnis, Christians, Druze, Shiites, and other segment of the countries that together make way over 50% of the majority. And they want Assad as the lesser of all evils that exist. So let me just go back to Vienna. Now we have Vienna, and Vienna, right now, US, Obama, to his credit, has backed off. John Kerry has backed off, saying that, yes, we will allow Assad to go, and we will allow it to be in future. That future could be 6 months, it could be 6 years. So that's being discussed. And that is a great solution if that happens. And that actually, by the way, meet the objective of Russia, that has no attachment, emotional or material or anything else, with Assad. Russia wants Assad to go, but they don't want the institutions of Assad to go. The same position with Iranian. So in an ironic way, Iranian and US and Russia, on political terms, on objective terms, they are on the same page. But politically, especially for the domestic audience of the United States, Obama has not shown the backbone to really be very clear about this issue. And Vienna is going on, and now here is the danger, which goes back to Dr. Perch's earlier allusion to this idea of maybe things just break apart. Right now, the conversation between Obama and Putin, Obama and President of France, President Hollande, and others, is about this issue of who is going to, what's going to happen out of Vienna. This is one question. So this is positioning. The attack on Raqqa, as we speak it, is about that. US is afraid of Russia taking over Raqqa and defeating ISIS. US is fearful of that. Not because they like ISIS, because they know at the negotiation table, Russia gonna be in a better position. Turkey is so very afraid of ISIS losing to Russia. That's why the downing of the plane. Otherwise, it's a joke for anybody who is has read anything about wars. It's a joke that, oh, Russian airplanes invaded Turkish airspace. So what? It happens every day. Not a big deal. You don't go to war over that. And all of this positioning. Turkey wants a permanent 60 miles zone away from Turkey. And that in order to suppress the Kurds and keep the terrorists and ISIS as a balancer. For Turkey, ISIS is less of a threat than the Kurdish, what they call terrorists, which is, by the way, 14 to 15% of the population in Turkey. So Turkey is at the forefront of a civil war. And it can happen the way it happened in Iraq so far, so many times. So in that peace conference, so-called Peace Vienna conference, these great powers are negotiating on the battlefield. But the danger is, including the downing of this airline, this fighter jet, the downer is that this could in and of itself escalate and becomes a regional war. Russia doesn't want it. President Obama doesn't want it. Turkey doesn't mind it. This is ironic, and they are instigating. Israel, which we haven't talked about here, is a great link in this problem. Israel doesn't mind it at all. They love it. It would be a great, great thing for them. So long as they're fighting, Israel is okay. And other powers. So I don't want to really expand this complexity to other issues, but you can see that this puzzle has so many fingers and legs, and we really need to be more analytical about our positions and stance.
Okay, we have time for just a couple more questions, and then we'll have closing comments from our panelists. So if you have a question, make sure you raise your hand high so I can get to you, okay? So, actually, I got to go to her first and then you, sorry.
Sorry about that. No, that's okay. So with the state monopolizing violence on its people and terrorism being a result of marginalization and oppression, where do you see the evolution of non-state actors? Where would you predict their importance, the importance that they'll be in the future? And also, could you ever see direct policies or funds being given to failed or failing states from the previous colonizing countries?
Who are you posing to? I don't know.
Yeah, that was two questions.
Which failed states are you thinking of?
It's more of a general question. What I'm asking is...
the European Union has several different programs involved in, they have a Middle East program, a North Africa, a Mediterranean. They have all sorts of programs. They're deeply aware of their colonial past, deeply aware of the ways in which they could turn those colonial connections into positive, what they would believe would be positive relations that would, quote unquote, develop those former colonies, and also, of course, help position the European Union as a strong influence in those regions. And then in terms of your question about non-state actors, do you mean like militias, or do you mean non-governmental organizations, or?
I'm talking about more of your militias, your terrorist organizations, things like that. They seem to have really come to plateau the importance since World War II, I guess, after World War II, non-state actors became
Yeah, I would say since the Iraq War, they've certainly become more influential in the Middle East in the ways that have already been discussed here. I don't know that I'm in a position to make a sort of, what other technological factors influence the influence of ISIS, right? So there was a question over here about what to do about ISIS. One way to address them is not necessarily to bomb them, and Dr. Sharifi handled that question far better than I could have. But you also might want to just starve them, and that means starve them of attention. That means taking care of your domestic concerns, taking care in Europe of the people who feel that they suffer from racism, alienation, hopelessness, lack of a future, no recognition by their home states, their European governments, and probably boredom. These people, they don't feel like they have much of a future, and they often are young men. So how to deal with them? Take care of your domestic problems. That won't give ISIS quite so many, people to appeal to. And then there's the whole question of arms. infrastructure in those countries, for sure, right? But then ISIS thrives on, and other groups, non-state actors, these sort of militia groups thrive on a huge arms trafficking network that's completely, it's too complex to solve with any one particular solution, of course, right? There's the whole black market, and there's a legal market, and then there are stolen goods and so forth. So, but yeah, I mean, handle domestic problems. States need to handle these domestic problems. I would think that would be one way. But these non-state groups will still be appealing to some people for sure. How much more so or less so? I think you risk making them more appealing if you form more of a fortress Europe or a fortress U.S. and say, go away, right? That's honestly my belief. I think that, if you turn toward a policy that says us, not them, that distinguishes between people on basis of certain identities, then you're going to make those kinds of groups probably more appealing.
The other thing is non-state actors are always a really good proxy for states, either regional powers or great powers, to go out there and get into proxy wars and fight their proxy battles for them on their behalf without ever getting your hands dirty. You can go out there and look at least throughout the history of the Cold War, where we and the Soviets engaged each other through those non-state actors. And so, to a certain degree, as long as you're going to have regional conflicts between regional powers, or it's starting to feel like we're getting to this point where we're looking at a lot of what's going on in Syria as maybe not intentionally, but becoming a conflict between Russia and the West, you're going to see conflicts where non-state actors are going to get propped up by the states to do our bidding for us. And so, if we don't find some solution to some of these problems, you're probably going to see more non-state actors getting involved in this.
Yeah, I agree with both of my colleagues. I think the binary between state and non-state actors, in fact, is a sort of liberal framing of things, and it doesn't really make sense in reality, because state actors and non-state actors have that dialectical, if you would, relationship with each other, and they have had it for a long time. But your question is mostly, it's not the place for it here, because we can go over to the world system. What type of world system do we have? In my personal opinion here, which is related to the roots of terrorism, obviously, it is not accidental that we have uneven development in the world. There are peoples that have so much of it, and it's wasteful, and there are billions of people that don't have it. They are marginalized, and that marginalization is not necessarily conspiratorial. It's not a bunch of people have sat down in a corner and then decided that all these people have to be deprived. That it's been the consequences of a world corporate capitalist liberal system that has created this uneven development. And this is a much bigger issue that you and I could really resolve here and now, or perhaps for the next decade or so. That's a different issue.
Okay, we're going to take 2 questions here, and then I have 2 questions on the other side, and then we'll go into closing statements, okay?
All right, so my question is mainly directed to Professor Sharifi, and it has to deal with when you were talking about the silence of the West in relation to the suffering of other nations. Were you saying that the silence in the Western powers of the world is what's breeding this extremism and terrorism? And then also, if we weren't so silent, if the West wasn't silent on the suffering of other countries, would there be less need for people to join these what we label as terrorist organizations?
Thank you. Well, I said Western media, silence of Western media. It's less than Western, silence of Western people or the West. I personally don't believe in that, again, dichotomy of West versus East. because with the new globalized system, the West is in the East and the East is in the West. And the poor and rich, it has been globalized in a sense. The same thing that Nikes and Adidas and all these brand gaps have been globalized, terror has been globalized. It's a terrorist globalization of terrorism, and all of these methods. By the way, terrorism, we didn't talk about it. Terrorism is a method, it's a technique, it's not a strategy, it's not an ideology. It really is not. It's a technique, it's a way of fighting. So in that sense, the idea of the Western media is silent, especially over some of the, like right now we have a genocide going on. Yemen, as we speak, there is a genocide in Yemen. And how many of you have talked about it or heard about it on the mainstream media? None. It's amazing. And of course, we are complicit in it as people living in the West. But certainly I cannot blame us because we are powerless in those areas. In those areas. But my point was to look at the Western media as a corporate organization or corporate-based organization that does not do its job, which is public information. And that is really problematic in many, many aspects beside terror and globalization of terror.
So given the developing events in Turkey and France's history kind of flip-flopping almost, because they reneged on their deal with Russia for the delivery of a warship, and now they're looking to perhaps partner with them in fighting, do you think that this could lead to a possible fracturing or issues within NATO, with any developing NATO action?
I don't think, my perception was that there really wasn't a NATO action in the offing, that it was going to be France trying to lead Europe independently of the U.S. It doesn't want the U.S. involved. France, I mean, this is back to this is an old stance that France has taken ever since the Fifth Republic began, which is essentially, we are going to lead Europe. We are going to be the dominant force in Europe. In fact, they didn't even want Britain to join the European Union for a long time, but for that very reason. And I think I see them trying to position themselves to be the leaders of a European, some sort of European, or representing European forces against Syria. And France has also opposed Turkish membership in the EU. It doesn't perceive, the Hollande administration, government may be a little different, but in the past 15, 20 years, the French leadership has definitely not perceived and not wanted to perceive Turkey as potential member of the EU, even though Turkey has been in accession processes formally since 2003. Its application to the EU has been accepted. So, and again, France is going to have an uphill battle in actually, I think, convincing other European Union member states, let alone all 48 other NATO member states, to take some sort of really strong NATO-led action here. And I don't think it doesn't seem to want to. Now, I will say all of that, saying that I don't feel I am the best qualified person to talk about the NATO element here. I'm more qualified to talk about the EU element. So.
Hello. I just have a short comment before my question. I certainly don't think or believe that, the ISIS or any of the listed terrorist groups represent all Muslims everywhere. And I think everybody here probably feels the same. But earlier you guys said that ISIS, or all terrorist groups for that matter, don't represent Islam. We see videos, being released of beheadings and deaths and bombings, and these terrorists, they cite directly from the Quran and the Hadiths. And, also testimonies of ex-Muslims and on YouTube, and just testimonies of why they left, validate this as accurate. Pew Research polls have shown that most moderate Muslims are in favor for Sharia law. There are riots all over Europe for Muslims to implement Sharia law as law of the land. In Indonesia, over 80%, what is Indonesia considered to be a moderate country, believe in stoning as an appropriate punishment for adultery. And so Sharia law is favored by most Muslims and shares some of the similar barbaric punishments such as, death to apostates and gays and with those same terrorist groups. So my question is, if what we see as moderates calling for share some of the same central tenets, why do you believe that ISIS, or any terrorist group for that matter, does not represent Islam?
Well,
unfortunately, I have to go. I'm sorry.
Yeah, thank you. In my comparative politics, when I teach it, the first thing I teach when we compare, if you want to be rational and logical about it, I say identify your unit of analysis. If your unit of analysis is individual, then whatever you apply to that individual doesn't necessarily mean you can take it and make a generalization of a collective. For example, you can say, I know it's kind of funny because some of you have heard it, you say, I saw an American. I saw a white American. He was generous. All Americans are generous. It's stupid, let alone be logical. The same thing goes with, I saw a Christian. His name was McVeigh. He was terrorist. He killed 250,000 people, 250 people. He murdered them. And he was also going to church. And all the people that go to church believe in Bible. Therefore, I couldn't say that McVeigh or all the people, or I could say that all the people that go to church and all the people that are Christians so believe exactly in McVeigh. This is pretty much the same premise. It's ridiculous. It's the notion that you can change your unit of analysis from individual to groups to nations to extra transnational communities all the way from Indonesia to Iran, to Middle East, to America, to people. It's illogical. But one more point, because your common link here is Sharia law. What does Sharia law means?
Wahhabi is Islamic law by Saudi Arabia, our closest ally. You're only buying into mainstream media because you need to fuel the industrial military complex. You need an enemy to justify these wars and fuel these industries. The Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore. You need a new boogeyman. The only people that fund ISIS is this government, the United Nations, to create instability.
Well, let me just please.
Please let the panelists finish, Kay.
Where people don't wear the hijab and that stuff, and those are the countries we're toppling, man. The ones that have democracy and whatnot. If they have democracy, then what is the first thing they're going to vote?
Okay.
Get European businesses and American businesses out of our country so we can nationalize our own resources. Like in Iran, they democratically in the 1950s elected Dr. Mossadegh as their leader. CIA overthrew him.
But my friend, if you allow me, because for the respect of, I know this is a format, and I know the structure of the format is not really as liberal as it should be, that everybody would take the microphone. For right now, let me just speak it, and of course, you can organize, and I would help you out to organize a group, and I will be attending your group, and you would have the microphone, and we would listen. This way, I think we will have a better dialogue. But let me just say this very important thing to my other friend here. And I want to say again, demystify the idea of Sharia. Sharia law in and of itself, if you translate it, literally translate it, it means common law. We in this country have common laws. In Britain, common laws sometimes go for 1,000 years back. In English, and in Arabic, we call it sunnah. Here, we call it tradition and precedent. Just changing the name from Arabic to English or English to Arabic shouldn't change the connotations and the meaning. Sharia law for thousands of years, for hundreds of years, not thousands of years, have been practiced in the part of the Muslim world as the common law of the people. And there is no body, not one body of Sharia law. It wasn't even like Christian laws that was superimposed or modified or moderated by the Holy Roman Empire. In the Islamic structure of development, as far as Muslims are concerned, they didn't have this unified church somewhere telling them what to do, what not to do. They were much more secular in that sense, and different communities developed different history of jurisprudence for them. As we speak, Wahhabi jurisprudence, Shiaism, Sunnism of different schools, from Shafi'i to name it. I don't want to just confuse you or confuse the audience with names. There are literally hundreds of schools of jurisprudence. And under each jurisprudence, the Sharia law means different things for different people and has been practiced for different locations. And they have precedent. Now, just the idea that just because it's Sharia law, that means it's savagery, it's racism. It is the idea that what the West does is legal, common sense, rational, and what millions of people have been doing for hundreds of years or not. And I don't want to bore you with some of the Sharia law are very much integrated with some of the law. Sharia law, the common law, the precedents, some of those logic of those jurisprudence, we use them in the West. If you want, we can have a session on the legal terms that are common between Western vocabulary, Latin vocabulary, and Arabic vocabulary. If you really want to have it, let's have a serious conversation on that. You know, let me just finish, please. So, to just relate Sharia law and say just because they believe in Sharia law, therefore they are savages and they don't know. They have laws. And the third point, or another point to compare to Sharia law. In the West, this is the West that we are talking about. Let me just be very focused on the United States. U.S. at this point in time, we believe in the idea of preemption. That means reading the intention of people. And we have allowed ourselves to break international law, Geneva law, human rights law, the one that we have signed ourselves. And we are breaking some domestic laws in order to, in fact, promote some security. And we have done so many things. And when I say we, you and I are not a part of it, but certainly we are living in that context. If we blame ourselves or the audience or Western people or Americans or Christians for many of the atrocities that has been done, take it from slavery, genocide, bombing, use of nuclear weapon, prison without judiciary supervision, and name it, and go on and on. Even as we speak, Guantanamo is still open, my friend. What kind of, I'd rather have Sharia law in Guantanamo than no law. People that have been held for 14 years and they have been found not guilty or haven't even been charged. So we shouldn't be sitting on the seat of judgment. And if we are, or if you are, or anybody is, at least we should be a little bit humble about all of these faults that exist with every religion, every rule, and every law.
All right, one more question, or do you guys need to, you need to go?
I'm going to go in a moment. Is it for Dr. Sharifi or?
I'm sorry. Just one more question, and then we will close.
Sorry for taking it back.
My question to Professor Sharifi, as we know, all tourist organization in the world trying to protect them opinion and their idea. So my question, why ISIS not trying to protect their idea in the media? Because we didn't see any member from ISIS trying to coming in the media and talking about ISIS like this. Why? Do you understand?
Yeah, I think I understand. Are you saying why the media, let's say mainstream media here, has not invited members of ISIS?
Yes.
Is that what you're saying?
That's my question.
Well, you have to ask the mass media. I don't know. I think you're extending the logic too much here, in a sense. Because, sometimes when I watch TV and I see two talking heads, usually from very well-known and most of the time to the right organization, on places like even PBS, which is publicly funded, and it's a little bit more to the right. And I say to myself, oh my God, even me, I don't know anything, but I know a lot of people that would know a whole lot more about whatever it is talking about. Why don't they bring them on TV? It's always a few talking heads. Like we have generals that they are so-called terrorist expert. We don't know why they are terrorist expert. We have people that are experts of Islam or experts of Middle East or expert of Saudi Arabia. I come from Iran. And every time I see an expert from Iran on PBS or CBS or CNN, I pretty much know them. And they are no expert of Iran. So the same thing goes with many others, many other idea of that the media, in fact, has not done its job in really being a medium for other people to sit in the judgment of who's really right, who's wrong. So your critique doesn't apply only to this particular issue, but in many other issues.
Okay, we have actually surpassed our times, but I want to thank you for everything. I want to offer any opportunity for closing statements from our panelists.
Thanks for coming.
Thanks for coming. I appreciate your being here. I just hope that in the future we have more panels like that. I really appreciate this was student-driven, and we are here as faculty to help and serve. Thank you.